Namaste and good evening, everyone. We are happy to have Narad with us. Namaste.
Thank you, namaste.
Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste to everybody.
We are happy to continue our series on the same subject, dreams, visions, outer body experience. And today we will be taking some very important questions. And these questions are all related, so perhaps we will merge them all and Sraddhalu will give us an answer. One first question from Blue Lotus Mom. Why does humanity have these out-of-body experiences, abilities? Is there a special purpose? Frederic, could you explain to us how out-of-body travel can help us in the integral yoga? And another question from Tiazman. In Letters on Yoga, I found that Sri Aurobindo says that he doesn't advise astral travel because of the dangers we could face. What are your thoughts on that? And we have two questions from Ashvini. Are dreams really required? Do they change the person or his consciousness? Do they change the person's consciousness as any spiritual experience? And second, if yogis can direct their dreams, why can't they reach dreamless state, which is considered a higher state?
Yes, these are all very important questions and we will address them all. First, I will touch upon as a superficial reply briefly, and then we will read from Sri Aurobindo, who will give us a comprehensive answer to all these questions and much more, in a way that will, as usual, blow your mind, but also take you into a depth of understanding and a completeness which I am sure you will not find anywhere else. So to first point of Blue Lotus Mom, why do we have this ability for going out of the body? That's because of the way we are constituted. We are made of many bodies. So obviously, if the bodies are reasonably independent in their functioning, one should be able to experience reality through each of these. And that's what happens in the out-of-body state. Frederic's question, how does out-of-body travel help us in integral yoga? Well, Sri Aurobindo will give us the detailed reply, but very simply said, it's because in that state one can access certain experiences which then can be more easily integrated in the body state. Third, which is Tizamen's question, he says he doesn't advise astral travel because of dangers. So we will look at first what it's about and the aspect of the dangers as well as the means to avoid those dangers will be taken up in greater detail next time. But what you will see in this description of Sri Aurobindo, he is not so concerned about dangers of astral travel. He presents to you this as something which he tells you how it is done, but also what is its utility and to what extent one can utilize it with great effect or even ignore to some extent. And finally, Ashwini's question, are dreams really required? Do they change person's consciousness, etc.? Yes, because we have different levels of reality on which we live because we have different bodies. And so the full scope of what dreams are and how they work, we will see in Sri Aurobindo's reply. But also this question about why can't we reach the dreamless state of sleep, which is considered higher. So I would simply ask, well, why should dreamless be higher? Shouldn't dream, depending on how you look at it, be of a greater value because you're doing something up there? So this whole business of dream and dreamless has been much misunderstood in the common vocabulary, and we will, on reading Sri Aurobindo, understand the deeper sense of these terms. So we will plunge straight to the text. In the description of today's session, I have put the links to two of these texts which I will be referring to. First, I will read the second text, which is also put in the link, number 2. Those who would like, you may follow from the text or ignore the links and listen rather, and then we can much more focus on the content of what Sri Aurobindo says. So in the second link, he describes what happens when you cross the border of consciousness and go behind the veil. And he says, last comes the crossing of the border. It is not falling asleep or a loss of consciousness, for the consciousness is there all the time. Only it shifts from the outer and physical, becomes closed to external things, and recedes into the inner psychic and vital part of the being. There it passes through many experiences. And then he says, both movements are necessary, the coming out of the inner being to the front as well as the going in of the consciousness to become aware of the inner self and nature. And then for many purposes, the ingoing movement is indispensable. Its effect is to break or at least to open and pass the barrier between this outer instrumental consciousness and that inner being which it very partially strives to express. And he speaks of how through the inward plunge these experiences can be deepened and the opening to the inner worlds made more complete. And he says the sadhak must understand that these experiences are not mere imaginations or dreams, but actual happenings. And each inner experience is perfectly real in its own way. And he says it is in the real with the reality of the inner self and the inner planes. It is a mistake to think that we live physically only or only with the outer mind and life. We are all the time living and acting on other planes of consciousness, meeting others there and acting upon them. And what we do and feel and think there, the forces we gather, the results we prepare, have an incalculable importance and effect unknown to us upon our outer life. Now, this was the text I had referred to last time when I said we will read from it. But he says we are actually not conscious here, but on other levels we are not so developed, we are all the time in some kind of interaction. And those things can have an incalculable importance and effect unknown to us upon our outer life. So this is the basis for many of these very loosely stated and sometimes wrongly stated positions that you find in a lot of the New Age teachings, where they will say, the universe bends over backwards to satisfy your desire if you put out your thoughts and emotions or call, and the universe will serve you, etc. It's not like that. It is that when something deep within you aspires intensely, it has an effect on those inner layers. And on those layers, things are made to happen, or we are in contact with things and forces, and so there's a ripple effect and its consequences. So it can often happen that on your surface life you say, I really want this, and somewhere in the inner layer something says, yeah, but I'm really scared of this, I don't know if this is good for me. Your really want on the surface is less powerful than the inner layer which says, oh, I don't think I should do this now. That will have a ripple effect which will prevent you while on the surface you seem to be chasing and trying. And so a lot of this will also relate to, for those of you who are interested in the experience of going out of the body, you must be fully aligned across all the layers within you that you want this. You can't have one part that says, I'm afraid, but what if? And those things will tend to act as a preventive even. But coming back to the text. All that we become and do and bear in the physical life is prepared behind the veil within us. It is therefore of immense importance for a yoga which aims at the transformation of life to grow conscious of what goes on within these domains, to be master there and be able to feel, know and deal with the secret forces that determine our destiny and our internal and external growth or decline. So, even if you are not interested in this mastery of the life, he says it is equally important for those who want that union with the divine, without which the transformation is impossible. The aspiration could not be realized if you remained bound by your external self, tied to the physical mind and its petty movements. It is not the outer being which is the urge, which is the source of the spiritual urge. The outer being only undergoes the inner drive from behind the veil. It is the inner psychic being in you that is the bhakta, the seeker after the union and the ananda. And what is impossible for the outer nature left to itself becomes perfectly possible when the barrier is down and the inner self in the front. Once the barrier breaks by one movement or the other, you begin to realize that all the processes and movements necessary to the yoga are within your reach, and so on. For the full text, you may look at the link and read on your own. But this is a first response from what we have read of Sri Aurobindo. Still the question would remain, well, what is this thing which is behind? How do we get to it? What are the possibilities of what one can do? How does it act upon the outer? How does it work? In brief. And this is given in a comprehensive reply by Sri Aurobindo in an entire chapter of the synthesis of yoga, which is called Samadhi. And we will read from that. I intend to read practically the whole of the chapter, but stopping, pausing for nuances and very important insights. Everything which we have been speaking of in this current theme of dreams and visions and out-of-body experiences, everything that we have been speaking of, you will find here in condensed, deep and comprehensive form. But because in his style he condenses so much, you have to pause sometimes and, so to say, decompress to see the full scope of implications and insights which he gives you. So this is the first link which takes you to the chapter called Samadhi in the Synthesis of Yoga, Book 1. In the first paragraph of this text, he says that there is a great importance to the phenomenon of yogic trance, which is called Samadhi. And he tells you what is broadly the understanding in various traditions. That he says it is supposed that there are states of being which can only be gained in trance. Now, when Sri Aurobindo says that it is supposed, he doesn't say it is so. When he says it is supposed, he is telling you that that's the belief among some people, but it's not entirely true. It is partly true that for those people or for a certain stage of evolution, you can only gain access to those states in trance. But as we will see in the text, he will say you can actually then develop the capacity to gain access to much of it without even needing to go into trance and be living in it while fully engaged with the surface consciousness at the same time. So what is taught to you in the traditional yoga teachings, even by some of the great authorities, is not always entirely true. It is at best indicative of one person's experience or the experience of one lineage. And it does not stop with that. There is much more to it which the lineage may not have access to or that person may not have fully opened to. And so in this first para, when he is summarizing the various lines of knowledge, you have to be careful to understand that's what is believed. He says, and especially is to be desired according to those systems, in which all action of awareness is abolished and there is no consciousness at all except the pure supramental immersion in immobile, timeless and infinite being. By passing away in this trance, the soul departs into the silence of the highest nirvana, etc. And then he says in the samadhi, this samadhi is not so important in the yoga of devotion, and yet when the devotional ecstasy or swoon of being takes place, well, it is a kind of samadhi also. But it is in the yoga of knowledge that you find the greatest importance given to samadhi. And to enter into it is the supreme step of the ladder of yogic practice in Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga. So there are many modern systems which derive from Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga, and even then you will find samadhi is the culmination. So in what is called classical yoga, Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, it is samadhi is the culmination of all those stages of gathering of consciousness, concentration, interiorization, immersion, eventually into samadhi. And that being the highest stage, well, what happens then? You stay in samadhi you withdraw and lose yourself into samadhi. Then comes Sri Aurobindo's position. What then is the nature of samadhi or the utility of its trance in an integral yoga? Because the integral yoga wants to transform and to manifest. It is evident that where our objective includes the possession of the divine in life, a state of cessation of life cannot be the last consummating step or the highest desirable condition. Yogic trance cannot be an aim, as in so many yogic systems, but only a means. And a means not of escape from the waking existence, but to enlarge and erase the whole seeing, living, and active consciousness. So the trance state will be used for this. Now, trance state is a very broad term, samadhi, and now we'll go into the nature of the samadhi and the stages or degrees of it, which will be the elaboration, which will also answer all the questions which have been raised. The importance of samadhi rests upon the truth which modern knowledge is rediscovering, but which has never been lost in Indian psychology, that only a small part, whether of world being or of our own being, comes into our ken or into our action. Ken is the boundary of our knowledge, of our awareness. So, of our being a small part, or even of world being a small part, comes into our scope of knowledge as well as our action. And this is what you can see also in physics, increasing recognition that the physical world is a mere appearance, underlying our realities or layers. But also in the psychology of modern science, we are beginning to recognize there is a whole, what they call unconscious, subconscious, etc., which is not really subconscious or unconscious. There are superconscious states as well as subliminal states separate from the subconscious. So even then, current understanding in sciences as well as modern psychology is very shallow and superficial. The rest, which we do not see, the rest is hidden behind in subliminal reaches of being, which descend into the profoundest depths of the subconscient and rise to highest peaks of superconscience, or which surround the little field of our waking self with a wide circumconscient existence, of which our mind and sense catch only a few indications. So, if we had to draw a picture, we could say the proverbial iceberg, but I will put it horizontally. The tip of the iceberg is this little you and your access to the experience of the world. Even when you look through the telescopes or microscopes, that's included in this little piece. The real you and scope of your consciousness is massive. It's not even 1/10 which is on the surface. It's less than 1%. The bulk of it, more than 99%, is this massive. And what is behind now plunges all the way through layers, not only into the subconscious, into the inconscient and into nations, no consciousness practically, and upward similarly rising to the highest superconscious, and within that gradations and gradations beyond anything we can conceive. So if you just take that whole column, pile of worlds, as is described in Savitri, Ashwapati sees the worlds as a chariot, pile of worlds as a chariot, as if we are this tiny little dot. You would be like the size of an atom compared to this massivity of it all. Little projection in front. But then there is this subliminal, which is, of which you are this tiny front, subliminal which encompasses and surrounds this little dot. Now you see where you are, you get a three-dimensional image of what is the reality. Our mind and sense catch only a few indications, and it's not even indications, just indications. The old Indian psychology expressed this fact by dividing consciousness into three provinces: waking state, dream state, sleep state. In Sanskrit, Jagrit, which is waking, Swapna, which is dream, Sushupti, which is sleep. So this whole domain broadly is cut into three. The little front which you are is the so-called waking state, a huge portion which is the so-called dream state, and beyond all this is the so-called sleep state. But remember, it has nothing to do with actual dream and sleep. And this he will explain later. It's a symbolic way of representing. And it's supposed, the Indian psychology, it's supposed in the human being a waking self, a dream self, a sleep self.
Sraddhalu, are you back online?
Yes, I'm back.
I think, yes, okay. So we just heard the sleeping self, waking self.
Okay. What was the last part which I spoke?
That's what I heard. The last part about the...
Okay.
Yeah.
I did not speak of Turiya, the fourth. Okay. So, I switched to a different internet link. The main internet, I think, went down. So, there are three states: waking self, dream state, sleep state, Jagrat, Swapna, Sushupti. And it's supposed, it meaning the old Indian psychology, it's supposed in the human being a waking self, a dream self, a sleep self. So according to the three states are three selves. So what we call me is the waking self. There's a deeper experience of I, which is called the dream self, and still beyond, the sleep self. With the supreme or absolute self of being, the fourth, or Turiya, beyond. The fourth word is Turiya, which translates as beyond. It's very interesting. In Sanskrit, the vocabulary is so precise. All these three can be described. That fourth one, you have no means to describe. So the only way to describe it is in relation to these by saying that is beyond all these. And so that's one description. That's a way of describing it. Of that Turiya, absolute self of being, of which all these are derivations for the enjoyment of relative experience in the world. So in all these three selves as well as states, you have relativity. Of course, as you go higher up, it is much more in oneness, but you have relativity. The fourth is an absolute self of being. There you don't have experience of relativity. So this is the framework he is referring to of the old Indian psychology, deriving from the Vedic psychology, divides consciousness into these three provinces and the fourth, which is beyond. Now, Sri Aurobindo now dives deep into what these three are, using this vocabulary but then explaining what these things mean. He says, if we examine the phraseology of the old books in this case are largely the Veda and the older Upanishads, we shall find that the waking state is the consciousness of the material universe which we normally possess in this embodied existence dominated by the physical mind. So you are embodied, you have taken birth, you have plugged into the biology, and the consciousness of the material universe which you normally have not in an abnormal condition, in this embodied existence, and which is characterized by what? Dominated by the physical mind. The mind embedded in the biology to the extent that it feels as if it's a product of the brain. And in this state, what you experience. This is what is called so-called Jagrit or waking state. The dream state is a consciousness corresponding to the subtler life plane and mind plane behind, which to us, even when we get intimations of them, have not the same concrete reality as the things of the physical existence. So we do get indications of these states, and when we do get those indications, we don't find them so very concrete. I'm just looking at the chat box. I hope nothing was skipped in between. Okay. So, we do get intimations, but the point is, whatever we get of intimations of these domains, it feels like you were dreaming. I'm going to share an interesting example, and maybe I'll draw on a few more examples as we go along, of how most people tend to respond to some of these experiences. I remember at one point I was in Delhi for a while, and Tara Johar, who was in charge of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch there, had asked me to use that occasion to take some classes there. And I was in a bit of a different mood, so I said I won't find it very interesting to just do theoretical things. I would like that people go deeper into practice, so let me take classes on the practice of the integral yoga. And so it was on Wednesdays, and I started, and there were very few people who showed interest in the practice. I remember the first time maybe we had 10 or 15 people. And I described certain things, and I said, okay, based on this now, let's do a practice of actually going into that kind of an inner state. And we went through a process similar to what I have placed there as a guided meditation. And then after an immersion in an inner state, we came back, and then I said, now you open your eyes. And quite a large number of people simply said, it felt like I was wandering off in some dreamlike state or in some imagination. And so I found that that was not the best way to do it. What I did the next time was, while in that interiorized state, I said, now you open your eyes. And then suddenly you have the shock that you're in a state which is so different from the surface consciousness, and you struggle. And that's when you register, your consciousness registered that there's actually a different state of being. In relation to the outer, this feels like almost dreamlike, and yet when you're fully in it, it is real and more real than the outer. And then from there, make a slow return, linking the two. And so I took it in that way, and I found that that was much more effective for people to experience the reality of it. But the reason I'm sharing this is because, in fact, very often we do go into these states, either in meditation or sometimes when you're in a half sleep or even in deep sleep state, and you do go or touch things, layers there. But on the return, when you come back plugged into the biology consciousness, the physical mind, it's all like a vague dream. You come out in the meditation, perhaps, sometimes it happens when you have eaten food and you're as if slipping into drowsiness in meditation, you're struggling to stay awake. You come out and you say, oh my God, I think I slept. And yet on return, you're very fresh, unusually fresh. So you know that it was not an ordinary sleep and it was not an ordinary dreamlike state. And yet if you do not link from there outward, you do not realize that actually that is more real than this waking state. So this is the point he's making, which to us, even when we get intimations of them, have not the same concrete reality as the things of the physical existence. You say, this is concrete, I can touch. That I can't touch, at least from here I cannot. Then there's the third state he describes. The sleep state is a consciousness corresponding to the supra-mental plane, proper to the gnosis. which is beyond our experience because our causal body or envelope of gnosis is not developed in us. Its faculties not active, and therefore we are in relation to that plane in a condition of dreamless sleep. Now we have to understand this term dreamless sleep has nothing to do with sleep, has nothing to do with dream. It's just a symbolic vocabulary used to describe that state. And he uses the word supramental as anything beyond the mental, but then proper to the gnosis, that is what we call the supermind. And in that, the body corresponding to it, or the grades of consciousness corresponding to it, is not developed in us, its faculty is not active, and therefore we are in relation to that plane in a condition of dreamless sleep. So if you become aware of that from here, or if you enter that, it will seem as if you went into some kind of dreamless sleep and came back. But again, it has nothing to do with dream or dreamless or sleep. It's just a symbolic description of these three broad domains of consciousness. And he will explain all this to us. The Turiya beyond, the fourth state, is the consciousness of our pure self-existence or our absolute being, with which we have no direct relation at all. You see, from within the relativities, you can only go into further relativities. Any consciousness that lives in the relativity can know something else, again, relative to itself. So you're always in the domain of relativity. When you break out of all relativities and enter into an absolute, what do? You have no way of relating this to that. How do you describe that in terms of this? Or how do you even describe this in terms of that with difficulty? So, with which we have no direct relations at all. Whatever mental reflections we may receive in our dream or our waking or even irrecoverably in our sleep consciousness. So you do get reflections of some kind, but you can't recover from that sleep state, or what is called the dreamless sleep state, which has been described here. You have something, but you can't quite recover. But something was there, and I can only remember as if I must have been asleep, but I don't even have a dream. From the intermediate domains, you have a memory of something, but it's like a dream recalled. That's why it's called dream. The fourfold scale corresponds to the degrees of the ladder of being by which we climb back towards the absolute divine. So think of it in these ways. We live here, we climb to this, climb to the next, and then come back to the absolute divine. Normally, therefore, we cannot get back from the physical mind to the higher planes or degrees of consciousness without receding from the waking state, without going in and away from it and losing touch with the material world. Hence, to those who desire to have the experience of these higher degrees, trance becomes a desirable thing, a means of escape from the limitations of the physical mind and nature. Now, if you understand the rationale for this, it's obvious that you want to get to that, you will have to withdraw from this. And the act of withdrawing and beginning to live in these states as stages is your state of trance, or degrees, even steps of trance. But this is the first impression, and we will see there is much more to it. Samadhi or yogic trance retires to increasing depths according as it draws farther and farther away from the normal or waking state and enters into degrees of consciousness less and less communicable to the waking mind, less and less ready to receive a summons from the waking world. So you enter deeper, it's harder to communicate with the waking state. Even if you do bring back memories, they are largely forgotten, vague impressions or dreams, but bizarre and unexplainable, ununderstandable to the physical mind, but also less and less ready to receive the summons from the waking world. Here there's a noise. If you go deep enough, you don't register it. If you go even deeper, you can get a whack on the body and you will not register it. It is narrated that Ramana Maharshi, when he was still a teenager, I believe when he was 12, 13 perhaps, he would go into such deep sleep that his friends would come and try to wake him up and he wouldn't register. They would shake him, he wouldn't register. And it's recorded that sometimes they would drag him out from the bed, take him out, beat him up, thrash him, bring him back and throw him back in the bed, and he did not register. And he would wake up from that deep sleep and find himself bruised, not knowing what had happened. But an equivalent thing happens consciously when he or somebody with that basic capacity of being able to withdraws sufficiently. So if you withdraw partially, you do hear sounds. You withdraw more, you don't register the sounds, but if it is shocking enough, loud enough, you may still say, yes, something's there, and maybe turn to pay attention. But if you withdraw further, even a whack on the surface, you would not register. Even a shock to the body, you may not register. So, beyond a certain point, the trance becomes complete, and it is then almost or quite impossible to awaken or call back the soul that has receded into them. Stages. You cannot. Quite impossible. Almost or quite impossible. It can only come back by its own will, or at most by a violent shock of physical appeal, dangerous to the system owing to the abrupt upheaval of return. You can make a real shock and pull back with an intensity, and then the shock can be harmful. So there is the incident I was told in the tradition of the Shankaracharyas in India, which is their four lineages established by the original Shankaracharya. There is a general guideline given by at least one of them who was known as Paramacharya. He had said that if ever they find him dead, if they think he is dead, then they should break 100 coconuts on his head, and if he still doesn't wake up, then he has actually died. Otherwise he might be in some deep state of trance, and the shock of those 100 coconuts might be enough. Break them on his head, crack a coconut. The shock of that might be enough to pull him back. But he said, don't rush to burn the body. And as is the case, we know also that this has happened in other cases. We know of, in the tradition, there are stories of saints who were actually considered dead. They put them on the funeral pyre and the person woke up because the shock of the heat and the burning of the body pulled back. So these are obviously not things which would be comfortable. Unless, and this was the point that Sri Aurobindo makes in one of the letters, he says that when the mother used to go into those domains very high, very deep, Sri Aurobindo himself would be present to guard, to protect. And I think mother makes the comment, or Sri Aurobindo also, that when one goes to that degree, then somebody with the necessary knowledge should be present physically protecting the body. Not just because some stupid human might say, you're dead, but even there are mischievous forces which may then use that occasion to try to harm. So somebody who has the necessary knowledge, who's sensitive enough, can feel where you are and can do what is needed to protect, or even hold a thread of link and help to draw you back when necessary. That becomes helpful. There are said to be supreme states of trance in which the soul, persisting for too long a time, cannot return. So even when you get there, you lose memory that this exists, and even the will to return might not remain. For it loses its hold on the cord which binds it to the consciousness of life, and the body is left maintained indeed in its set position, not dead by dissolution, but incapable of recovering the ensouled life which had inhabited it. So this is also greatly valued in the ascetic traditions. The Sant Jnaneshwar in Maharashtra is one of those very famous saints in Aurobindo, if I recall right, where he went into this living trance and was entombed, put into a samadhi, while still sitting in trance, and withdrawn in such a state. So in such a state, the body will not decompose, but he is seated, and it's sustained by that link, but not enough to be able to pull back. But it is said that a couple of decades down, he appeared in dream to one of the disciples and told him, please help me, because there's a root of a tree which is poking my body. So they opened the samadhi, go inside into the chamber, and they found actually there was a tree root which had come, and they cut it. His body was still intact, and they closed it again. So yes, these things do happen, and he is explaining to you the rationale of how it happens. The body is left maintained indeed in its set position, not dead by dissolution, but incapable of recovering the ensouled life which had inhabited it. Finally, the yogin acquires at a certain stage of development the power of abandoning his body definitively without the ordinary phenomena of death by an act of will. So you have the full working biology, you've gone to that point to say, okay, I now disconnect. That's it. So it's not a normal phenomenon of death. There's nothing in the body to shut it down by itself. It's just a withdrawal by which the body now is no more supported. Or by a process of withdrawing the pranic life force through the gate of the upward life current, Udana. Open it for it away through the mystic Brahma Randra in the head. By departure from life in the state of Samadhi, he attains directly to the higher status of being to which he aspires. So while being in the body, you go into that state, you are now as close to that zone of the emergence with the highest transcendence that you seek. You have still this link, and then gradually you withdraw the life force and withdraw the link through the Brahma Randra, which is the whole, Randra is the whole Brahma, the whole of Brahman, and through which you withdraw the link, and then there's the departure. You are already there, so you disconnect from the body and poof, you merge into whatever it is was your goal. So again, he is summarizing what are the things which are highly valued and the broad understanding of the Samadhi in the context of existing traditions and the yogic knowledge. Now comes an elaboration of these three and the relevance of these three for the outer and particularly for the integral yoga. So in the elaboration now we will get a full understanding of what's really happening in this, from waking state to what is called the dream state to what is called the sleep state. First of all, remember, it has nothing to do with ordinary dream or ordinary sleep, and he will explain that. In the so-called dream state, remember, the consciousness withdraws from the surface biology, physical world, and is then in the vital and mental worlds, primarily. In the dream state itself, there are an infinite series of depths. From the lighter, recall is easy, and the world of the physical senses is at the doors, though for the moment shut out. In the deeper, it becomes remote and less able to break in. It, that is the physical world, becomes remote and less able to break in upon the inner absorption. The mind has entered into secure depths of trance. So, this is extremely important to understand. He said it in such simple terms you would normally read, and I'm sorry, I've heard people read these lines just, yes, but why doesn't he explain more? No, he's actually told you a lot in this. We'll look at this a little bit in detail. So the dream state itself, there are an infinite series of depths. Now in a normal English language you will say, there is an infinite series, a series. No, he says there are an infinite series of depths, many depths. So what that's telling you is something very different. There are series and series and series ad infinitum. So a series which can be infinite, but there are many series which are infinite. That's what he's telling you. And this gives you a sense of the nature of just the vital world, let's say. In the first entry into this so-called dream state, from the close to the surface to the most deep, you can call that one series of infinity. Again, series of depths. Each is a depth, but a series of depths. Why not just say a continuum, which is infinitely fine? No. The point is that each of these has a distinctness of layer. Each layer is infinite, and within each layer is an infinity of range. But between two layers, it's not that there is this one and then that one and something in between. You will find an infinity of layers in between. So you could go into one grade of world, shift a little bit into another grade, and in each you will find an infinity of variations. But in between these you will find an infinity of intermediate. So this phrasing is very suggestive and very important. There are an infinite series of depths, not just one depth, not just two depths. Infinite series, and each series is fully opening out into infinity. So from the lighter ranges, which are closer to the surface, recall is easy, and the world of physical senses is at the doors. So you've gone in, you're in this, oh wow, that's interesting. But if there's a loud sound, I say, yes, there's something out there happening which is calling me back. You go deep enough, it becomes so remote that you cannot be disturbed from that absorption. So that he calls secure depths of trance. Now this is true not only of the vital world, this is true of the mental worlds and all the intermediate blendings of these two, which are also an infinite range. Now he explains, if you have called this a depth of trance, he says there is a complete difference between samadhi and normal sleep. Although we have referred to this as the dream state. Between the dream state of yoga and the physical state of dream. So what is this physical state of dream? That's what we have as dreams, he explains. And then this so-called yogic dream state, he explains. The latter, that is the physical state of dream, when we are dreaming at night, belongs to the physical mind. Brain, mind, physical consciousness. In the former, that is the dream state of yoga, the mind proper and subtle is at work liberated from the immixture of the physical mentality. So you have mind embedded in the biology and brain, and mind which is completely free, liberated, proper in itself, subtle, and no mixture of physicality there. And these are two completely different states, but they are mind nevertheless. The dreams of the physical mind are an incoherent jumble made up partly of responses to vague touches from the physical world around, which the lower mind faculties, disconnected from the will and reason, the buddhi, weave a web of wandering fantasy, partly of disordered associations from the brain memory, partly of reflections from the soul traveling on the mental plane. So now it's a longish sentence, but he's telling you what forms your normal dreams, which is happening in this physical mind. Incoherent jumble made up of partly so many things. What are the things? Responses to vague touches from the physical world around. So as you're sleeping, there's a horn, there's the sound of a siren, or some animal or bird or somebody, or the air conditioning, water dripping, rain, any sound. You hear fragments or you recall fragments, but first, and incoherent jumble, vague touches from the physical world, which the lower mind faculties, disconnected from the will and reason, the buddhi, weave a web of wandering fantasy. So your buddhi and will and reason have pulled out. This lower functioning of mind now has nothing to make it coherent. So what does it do? Weave a web of wandering fantasy, P-H-A-N, as distinct from F-A-N. He will use both words. This fantasy is like the phantasm, like a creation of fantastic imagination. Partly of disordered associations from the brain memory, partly of reflections from the soul traveling on the mental plane. So the moment I hear, let's say, rain falling outside, that draws from my past memories, those things come up. And the other thing is reflections from the soul traveling on the mental plane, which has wandered off on other levels. From that higher, what we will call the yogic dream state or sleep state, there are the reflections. Reflections which are ordinarily received without intelligence or coordination. So which explains why all this confusion happens even when there is a true dream experience behind. There's nothing to order it. If you have trained your physical mind sufficiently, then it will build an order, but the order will still be a habitual order and not a real understanding. Wildly distorted in the reception and mixed up confusedly with the other dream elements, with brain memories and fantastic responses to any sensory touch from the physical world. So in the physical world, somebody is ringing the doorbell and it will trigger a whole different thing in the phantasm of the creations with a mix of all these things. Even something happening on the higher planes might be now interpreted through the symbolism of the doorbell ringing, etc. Wildly distorted, and the confusion. In the yogic dream state, on the other hand, the mind is in clear possession of itself, though not of the physical world. So you are in this full awareness, in fact a much more liberated and clear awareness, but you are not aware of the physical world. You are in mind proper. Works coherently and is able to use either its ordinary will and intelligence with a concentrated power, or else the higher will and intelligence of the more exalted planes of mind. Now all depends on your current evolutionary state. If you are in a reasonably low grade of evolution, then you have the ordinary power of your will and intelligence. If you have sufficiently worked to open to still higher gradations, evolved a little bit, not yet fully integrated perhaps, then you have access to those higher will and intelligence from the higher planes of mind. It withdraws from experience of the outer world. It puts its seal upon the physical senses and their doors of communication with material things. So we are using an image now. You withdraw, close the doors and windows and put a seal on it. So even if something tries to break through, it does not. Even if a dog barks, someone calls, the doorbell rings, it does not come through because of the seal put. So here he is already teaching you the technique. The technique for entering those deeper states and staying in those deeper states. So first of all, you have the power to withdraw. Having withdrawn, you go deep enough, but before you go deep enough, you close these gates and then put a seal. How we do that, we will see shortly. But you do that, then you are able to stay without this disturbance. But everything that is proper to itself, thought, reasoning, reflection, vision, reflection meaning thinking power, vision, it can continue to execute with an increased purity and power of sovereign concentration, free from the distractions and unsteadiness of the waking mind. Now, actually, in this mind, you may think, oh, I am reasonably good, intelligent, reasonably good. You go into that state, you find your intelligence and powers of mind are enormously amplified. And all this dulling takes place when you're identified with the physical brain. You come out and wow, you're so much more intelligent. If only you could be like that in your waking state. And there we get the importance of these experiences. It can use too its will and produce upon itself or upon its environment mental, moral and even physical effects, which may continue and have their after consequences on the waking state subsequent to the cessation of the trance. So you go into this trance state, now you work upon yourself, reprogram your mind, change your mentality, reshape things, activate certain things, build new habits, change the directions, priorities, many things you can do. But not just on itself, but on the environing mental, moral and physical. You can produce impacts, imprints, effects, which will have their consequences in the waking state after you have come out from trance. So if we may give an example of this, the mother going into its trance state. It's not this, she went much higher, they went all the way to the overmental consciousness. But in that activity which is described in 1920, the mother goes to this higher state. Sri Aurobindo is supporting her, but he is in the physical consciousness here. And in that state, they are working to liberate India. She does what she has to do there, initiates the process, the thing is done. And from that state, she is linked with the physical body only by speech. She says, it is done, India is free. She comes back. The chain of events initiated and the consequences are still working through across the years. You can of course go back, make modifications, intervene, but what has been done now just goes on. Interesting. We have an experience of this very superficially. You sit down, think very strongly of doing something or put out a very strong desire. You've created a thought form and desire bundle which goes out and does its thing. But this power is so weak compared to what is done on those levels. If you have developed the capacity to stay and act on those levels. Now comes this point. To arrive at full possession of the powers of the dream state, which we don't have currently, it is necessary first to exclude the attack of sights, sounds, etc. of the outer world upon the physical organs. It is quite possible indeed to be aware in the dream trance of the outer physical world through the subtle senses which belong to the subtle body. One may be aware of them just so far as one chooses, or on a much wider scale than in the waking condition. For the subtle senses have a far more powerful range than the gross physical organs, a range which may be made practically unlimited. Now this actually needs quite an elaboration if we want to go fully into it, but we'll just touch upon the main ideas. First thing, when you want to develop this full possession of your power of dream state, you must exclude the attack of the sights and sounds of the outer world upon the physical organs. He is describing it as an attack. That itself is suggestive, and think about the implications. But when you do that, first of all, physically, of course, you will minimize intrusions. But also when you withdraw in consciousness, you have to, so to say, seal the doors of the senses. But he says you can be aware of the physical world from that state, but using the subtle senses. So if you withdraw from the physical senses, it doesn't mean you will be unaware of the physical world. It will be through subtle senses, which belong to the subtle body. So as in an out-of-body state. Now you may not be out of body necessarily, but whether you're in this withdrawn trance state or you also go out of body in this state, you'll still have access to the physical world using these subtle senses. And using these subtle senses, you can, from the subtle body, you may be aware as much as you want of the physical world or as little as you want. But when you choose to, the capacity is far wider than in the waking condition. Because the subtle senses have a more powerful range, far more powerful range than the gross physical organs. You see, gross physical organs are limited by the physicality of the machinery. The subtle senses are directly acting in domain of consciousness. So what physically you may hear, let's say for, depending on the damage to your ears, 10 meters or 20 meters if you are young, or less when you become old, you come out into your subtle body or in the subtle consciousness and you listen, you can hear 1,000 meters away. Well, to begin with, let's say you hear 30, 40, 50, 60 meters, 100 meters away, without difficulty. And then you choose to listen farther and farther and farther, and you can go 1,000 meters, 10,000 meters. There's practically no limit. So the suggestion he makes here, the subtle senses have a far more powerful range than the gross physical organs, a range which may be made practically unlimited. May be made, meaning there is a training involved there. You can extend the range, but you have to work on it to extend it. But already it is far more. So without having made any effort, you're already sensing not only greater distance, greater finer nuances, subtleties, a range of colors and subtleties of even shades of sounds, touches, and so on. And the interesting thing is, in the subtle body, the five senses are not so split and divided. You see, in the biology, the five senses operate through five different organs. So hearing and sight and touch are so different. If I am hearing, I don't see. What I see, I don't hear. They are different processes. But in the subtle body, as you see, the sight is also a touch. And the touch is also a hearing and a smell. Interesting. Actually, we do have an experience of this very subtly, but it is so subtle we tend to ignore it. You look at a cloud, that little puff of floating in the sky, it feels so light. You're feeling it. It feels so soft, as if cotton, isn't it? How are you feeling the softness? And it's not just a question of the image throwing an association. You can as if feel and touch the softness. And this is a subjective evidence that actually your physical senses are a support for the subtle senses, and the real sight is always by the subtle sight. But now reduced to the machinery by dependence on the physical sense in your surface waking consciousness. So if you understand this, you can slowly amplify the subtle perception to a point where it exceeds the physical while you're still in the body. But to develop this, to have had that experience and developed it there would be a great help. And then when you come back, you can as if infuse that capacity developed there into this. You will remember a description that the mother had of going to the circus in Paris as a child. I forget the name of the circus, one of those famous ones. And there she met a Native American who became a good friend for her because of the deeper dimension of the consciousness. And he would demonstrate how he would put his ear on the ground and tell you from which direction somebody was coming. And even sometimes what distance the person was. Obviously, it's not just a physical hearing. It's this subtle sense, but with the physical ear tuned through which the subtle sense now operates, but still reduced by the physical ear. So it needed to put the ear to the ground. Those of you who might be fans of the Dune novel series or the cinema series, in the new Dune 2, which has just been released, there is this thing which was first suggested in Dune 1, that this young man is trained with powers of amplification of the subtle perceptions. But in part 2, he's hiding under the ground. He hears the footsteps and recognizes who it is by the footsteps. Now there is no way by a purely physical process you can recognize a person by footsteps. Because you can be walking differently at different times, and you're walking in sand, it can be completely different. It will never be crisp, clear sound, and it will change according to the shoes you wear, etc. Of course, so that you can say, that's, you dismiss it as a cinema imagination. But there's a truth to it. The truth is, as you listen to the footsteps, your inner subtle sense touches and feels the vibes of the person and recognizes who it is. Not by the footsteps, but using footsteps as a support to link to the consciousness. So this is the reality of how the subtle senses superimposed on the physical can actually be activated and developed much more. But in their own domain, they can be made practically unlimited. And we're coming back to the text now. But this awareness of the physical world through the subtle senses is something quite different from our normal awareness of it through the physical organs. The latter, the physical organs, is incompatible with the settled state of trance. For the pressure of the physical senses breaks the samadhi and calls back the mind to live in their normal field where alone they have power, that is the physical organs. So this is the problem. You're in that state of perception. If you say, all right, I'm going to plug in into the physical will pull the consciousness back and reduce it to its domain and its limits. And so if you really want to operate with the subtle senses, you have to maintain this separation, at least for that purpose. The pressure of the physical senses breaks the samadhi, breaks this exclusive separation and immersion in the free operation of the mind in the subtle body. But the subtle senses have power in their world, and the physical senses have power only in the physical world, and with limitation. But the subtle senses have power both upon their own planes and upon the physical world, though this is to them more remote than their own world of being. So when you're in the subtle body and a deep immersion, as let's say in deep concentration or meditation, here you are here. The physical world is remote. It feels superficial, fickle, weak, thin, unreal almost, dreamlike. You come back into the physical world, that feels dreamlike. But when you're there, that is more dense, much more vivid than the physical. In yoga, and he's speaking of the general tradition, in yoga various devices are used to seal up the doors of the physical sense. Some of them physical devices. But the one all-sufficient means is a force of concentration by which the mind is drawn inward to depths where the call of physical things can no longer easily attain to it. So, you can physically block off, put a earplug, for example. Of course, in yoga you have other processes, but even physical practices in Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga, for example. But discarding all that, he says the direct concentration, power of concentration, is all sufficient. It can do as much and definitely even much more. Draw it inward to depths where the call of physical things can no longer easily attain to it. Now, this is a practice which I would highly recommend for all of you. It's not difficult at all. If you have a basic capacity of withdrawing into any kind of state of concentration or meditation, don't stop there. As I mentioned the last few times, always push the boundary a little more, a little more, a little more. And you'll find once you get the hang of this inward movement, you can actually plunge deep or allow yourself to be pulled deep, and to a point where you're so immersed in that you even forget there's a physical world. Take it to that point where you lose sensation of the physical world, even lose memory of the physical world. It doesn't exist. Nothing else exists except this. Hold this state. And it's only by sustained practice you will get to it. And sometimes if you do it with a little bit of help, even within a few days you can experience it. It may take longer to stabilize it as an active, easy aid, to come to that easily and stay in it for as long as you want. But getting to the experience is not difficult. I mentioned last time particularly this guided meditation which I have put online called Descent of Peace, guided meditation for descent of peace. And you will find that helpful because it helps you get to that first level where you're conscious of yourself in the subtle physical body, which is felt as a expanded envelope of awareness, very dense, and separated from the physical body enough that you can stay in that quite independently. Use that as your starting point, and then turn your awareness into the deep peace that you feel. Hold and immerse yourself into the peace, consciously choosing to ignore all else and let all else fade out, and then stay immersed more and more and deepen into it and deepen. Let it draw you into itself. And this would be the easiest way. In a few days, in a few sessions, you'll find you can go quite deep to the point where you don't register sounds from outside. You forget there's a world outside. Of course, you never lose it fully. It's at the back of the mind, you know, but actively you're not bothered. And then from there you can come back. The moment you come back from such a state, touch the surface awareness, replug, and then immediately pull back and settle in it. And then again come back slowly. Touch the surface awareness, immediately pull back, depending on your capacity for sustaining concentration. Do this at least twice, but return slowly and immediately pull back. The result will be the access to this will become more familiar. And next time you'll be able to go almost immediately to a deeper stage than before, and each time more. So, the one all-sufficient means is a force of concentration by which the mind is drawn inward to depths where the call of physical things can no longer easily attain to it. You do not need to use physical devices. And I would recommend not to rely on physical devices. Work on this. And it's not difficult. This is the first necessity. The second necessity, he says, is to get rid of the intervention of physical sleep. So the moment you do this, your body says, yes, I'm supposed to go to sleep. This is a sleep state. And it wants to sink into unconscious state. The ordinary habit of the mind when it goes in away from contact with physical things is to fall into the torpor of sleep or its dreams. And therefore, when called in for the purpose of samadhi, it gives or tends to give at the first chance by sheer force of habit, not the response demanded, but its usual response of physical slumber. Okay, so here he is not speaking of the body's tendency. He says the mind's tendency is to fall asleep. The moment you disengage from the surface senses, what are you plugged into? We are so used to, by habit, always turned out through physical senses, that the moment you withdraw, well, where are my senses? What am I looking? What am I hearing? What am I touching, smelling, tasting? Nothing. Oh, this is sleep and the habit. So the trick to do this is, as you withdraw, turn upon itself. Become aware of the, so in that practice from that guided meditation, turn upon the silence. Listen to the silence and the deep intensity of the silence. Feel the denseness of the silence. View, not creating a picture, but as if you are aware of the width and vastness or the dense depth of silence. So it's as if your senses which were turned outward, you turn upon the nature of your own consciousness and the quality of that consciousness. And that's how you keep it busy. Your inner senses turned upon the experience itself is one way by which you can teach the mind, oh, this is not sleep, I'm experiencing something. It's not a blank. So, its usual response of physical slumber we are now bypassing by this, and this habit of the mind has to be got rid of. The mind has to learn to be awake in the dream state, in possession of itself, not with the outgoing but with the ingathered wakefulness. So outgoing wakefulness versus ingathered wakefulness, in which, though immersed in itself, it exercises all its powers. Focus on this, build this, develop this capacity. Now again, you see the key here is a power of concentration. So those of you who have developed a power of concentration will find all these things to be quite easy. If you have not developed your power of concentration, the act of making this effort will develop it, and quite rapidly. But your key will be power of concentration. I cannot emphasize this enough, but in all of the inner ranges of spiritual experience or occult experience or whatever you choose, if you have a developed power of concentration, combined with an intuitive sense of where you want to go, with these two, you have the means to reach anything, any experience. And this, Sri Aurobindo has explained in the earlier chapters of the Synthesis of Yoga, in a passage which most people just don't understand the value of. He's teaching you the fundamental technique of how you do something, how you attain to any experience. And I'm sorry to find even today, I must use a strong word to abuse them, people who claim Sri Aurobindo did not teach methods. No, he taught you the method by which all techniques become effective. And this we have described in the direct method in a discussion in that series, on the evening series from 82 onwards. Review those if you have not seen those talks. The direct method and then the sunlit path and so on, where I discuss why you do not need indirect methods such as japa and visualizations or other means, and you can directly enter into these kinds of states. But these two twin powers, the concentrated focus, the tapas, combined with the inherent deeper knowledge, or the term Shraddha or innate faith and intuitive knowing, these two combined, you can actually navigate now to reach any experience and stay stable in it. So build the power of concentration. The other thing already is innately present, it will lead you. But build the power of concentration and do not let it weaken, and you have access to all these possibilities very rapidly. So this second thing is to get rid of the habit of the mind to fall asleep. Now already some of you would notice, if you have read a little bit of Mark's book or some of these out-of-body experience texts or methods, one of the problems for those who want to experience going out of the body is to be able to go into this deep state of complete stillness and silence and relaxation, but not fall asleep. Common thing for meditation as well as for out-of-body experience. In both you want to withdraw from the outer senses. In both you want to not fall asleep. But then what you do from that state is slightly different. But effectively the initial stages are similar, or even the same. Now, let's say you've got to this point. And you're now exploring, well, what do I do with this state? What can I know? What can I reach out to experience? And comes one paragraph where he describes this. And again, it's extremely condensed, so it covers a huge scope. The experiences of the dream state are infinitely various. So let's summarize infinitely various in one para. For not only has it sovereign possession of the usual mental powers, you're not asleep, you're fully awake and even amplified in your powers of mind. Reasoning, discrimination, will, imagination, and can use them in whatever way, on whatever subject, for whatever purpose it pleases. Literally, you can do anything. But it is able to establish connection with all the worlds to which it has natural access, or to which it chooses to acquire access, from the physical to the higher mental worlds. Now, you've got to this point, you can actually access everything from the physical world to the higher mental worlds. Everything is now available to you. And these powers of the mind, let's repeat the list. Reasoning, discrimination, willpower, imagination. You can use in whatever way, connect to all these worlds or any of these worlds, or whatever naturally at that moment you have access to. And what do you do with it? Anything. With your power of imagination, reasoning, will, you can build, even create, manifest, just by intending. As happens for most of you would have experienced in dream or lucid dream state. You can literally will your reality to become anything, but also perceive and interact with things and go anywhere. So he'll give you a broad list. This it does by various means, open to the subtlety, flexibility and comprehensive movement of this internalized mind, liberated from the narrow limitations of the physical outward going senses. Subtlety, flexibility and comprehensive movement of this internalized mind. It is able first to take cognizance of all things, whether in the material world or upon other planes, by aid of perceptible images. So you can literally see. But as you perceive, as I said, there's also a touch involved and multi-sensory experience. Whether in the material world or upon other planes, by aid of perceptible images, not only images of things visible, but of sounds, touch, smell, taste, movement, action, of all that makes itself sensible to the mind and its organs. So visible things and what is not visible also you can perceive in this way. Sound, taste, smell, taste, movement and action is also perceived, almost like a sense, and of whatever makes itself sensible to the mind and its organs. Now when you actually look at, let's say, the physical world, you may look at physical things, but also invisible things of the physical, such as magnetic fields. You can see magnetic fields. You can see an aura as if around things, which is not accessible to the physical sight, for example. You can see in the ultraviolet, infrared, X-ray or other frequencies which are not accessible to your physical senses. You can see things which are invisible forces which are trying to work out certain things. Beings which are of a subtle physical domain, not accessible to your physical sight. Everything, no limit of what you can perceive. Intentions, tendencies, you see and you can even register as visually as objects. So that's why he uses perceptible images. Doesn't mean the thing is an image or has an image. It can be a force, but you have a perceptible image of the force. This is part of the problem of people who go into the subtle worlds or have outer body experiences in the beginning. They don't understand that these are not things as such. Of course, they are perceived as things, but they may be forces, tendencies, impressions, hanging in the air as an impression of something in the past or even something imminent. But you see it, or register it rather, as perceptible images with sound, touch, smell, taste, movement, action, etc. In one of the interviews, discussions which I had with Mark O'Byrne, which will be aired shortly, he describes, we were discussing what happens when people have connections with unhealthy connections with what he calls parasites, beings which attach themselves and do things. And one of the ways by which he says you sense is when you see a person with the inner sight, it's as if there's a sound or a melody to their consciousness or to their aura. And when there is a parasite attached, it is heard as a dissonance in the sound. Interesting way. Interesting, isn't it? But the point is, it can be through any of the five senses. You will feel the dissonance or the disharmony of some kind, etc. So perceptible image is a general term he uses, but showing the broad nature of the perceptions here. For the mind in samadhi has access to the inner space called sometimes the chid akasha. Chid is consciousness, akasha is ether or space. So the consciousness ether. Now we'll use this word ether because Aurobindo himself will use it now and will relate it to a discussion which, if you have heard the talk on the ether, you will understand. Access to the inner space called sometimes the chid akasha, to depths of more and more subtle ether which are heavily curtained from the physical sense by the grosser ether of the material universe. And all other sensible and all things sensible, whether in the material world or in any other, create reconstituting vibrations, sensible echoes, reproductions, recurrent images of themselves, which that subtler ether receives and retains. So here is an entire technology he is presenting to you in summary form, that there is a physical ether, which is much grosser, which is the basis for the physical universe. There is a, broadly we will call subtle ether, which is the chit akasha, which is the basis for the inner subtle worlds. But in the inner ether, there are finer and finer gradations, more and more subtle ether, curtained from the physical senses by the grosser ether of the material universe. So now we understand why the physical senses cannot see the inner, but why the inner can see the grosser physical. But the point he makes is, all things sensible, whether in the material or any other, create reconstituting vibrations, sensible echoes, reproductions, recurrent images of themselves. So the fact that something is happening on this layer has a ripple effect, because what is the ether? It is the underlying consciousness, and its characteristic is vibration. If something vibrates, it ripples across into the subtle ones. And if something ripples in the subtle layer, it ripples into other related subtler or grosser layers. So he uses this phrasing which is very suggestive, reconstituting vibrations. That is, you have a vibration here, it reconstitutes on a different level by an equivalent vibration representing this on that subtler or grosser level. Sensible echoes, like in the physical world you have an echo of a sound. Well, this produces an echo but which can be sensed, touched, felt palpably. Reproductions in the result. So if something is formed here, it forms there its echo image. You have an apple in the physical world. In the subtle world, it will produce an influence which will be represented in the appleness quality of the apple, for example. And you can manipulate there to produce results here, or manipulate this and produce across the two, because they're echoing, they're connected. Recurrent images of themselves. So something happens, especially on higher worlds, it has reflections all the way down, except in the most material, which is the gross ether, so gross and dense that it cannot catch easily there. But you'll still have an imprint of an energetic feel, which is the reason why every higher spiritual truth has its equivalent representation on all the planes. So you can have gods, deities of the higher planes, and you'll have their equivalent representation in the lower vital, higher vital, and every plane practically, which that subtle ether receives and retains. So anything happened there as an event, repercussions here. It is this which explains many of the phenomena of clairvoyance, clairaudience, etc. You hear from far, you perceive from far, etc. Or subtly, you perceive subtle sounds or perceive subtle images and forms. For these phenomena are only the exceptional admission of the waking mentality into a limited sensitiveness to what might be called the image memory of the subtle ether, by which not only the signs of all things past and present, but even those things of future can be seized. So, your waking mentality has an exceptional admission. Normally it's not allowed, but exceptionally it has been allowed to peek into those finer gradations of ether, and it says, there's something here. But what is it? It is imaged and open to interpretation by the receiving consciousness. So if you have an intuitivized mind, you'll perceive, yes, that's what it is. If you don't have intuitivized, you'll say, I am seeing this image, what does it mean? I have to ask someone. But sometimes the image may be of an event that's about to occur, and you're seeing it happen in that imagery, but it's not yet happened physically. But it's about to happen maybe a few days down. So he explains how. For things future are already accomplished to knowledge and vision on higher planes of mind, and their images can be reflected upon mind in the present. So what is future up there is seen, felt, known, and reflects here and perceived in the present here. But these things, which are exceptional to the waking mentality, difficult and to be perceived only by the possession of a special power, or else after assiduous training, are natural to the dream state of trance consciousness in which the subliminal mind is free. So you may go through a long training or under abnormal states, you see all this and still not reliably. But you're out there in that liberated condition of your mind, it's natural, effortless. And that mind can also take cognizance of things on various planes, not only by these sensible images, but by a species of thought perception or of thought reception and impression, analogous to that phenomenon of consciousness which in modern psychical science has been given the name of telepathy. So now he's brought in this word telepathy, but he's not happy with the word telepathy as it is used. He is using a different vocabulary. He says, by a species of thought perception or thought reception and thought impression, which is similar to what is called telepathy. By that process, you can take cognizance of things on various planes. Not only by these sensible images, but by a direct perception, which he describes as a thought reception, thought impression, or thought perception. So you perceive as if in your mind consciousness directly the thing on a different plane or a different grade, or even on the physical plane from there. So that's a thought perception, or a thought reception. It's as if that thing reflects into your consciousness. Or a thought impression, you don't have a clear perception, but a tendency of the force is felt. So there are 3 degrees, from a more direct to a less direct, more complete to a less complete. And often this kind of a perception is confused by people as an out-of-body experience. In the talk which we will put up soon of Mark Oburn, he distinguishes between all these, and he says this is not out-of-body experience. But it is in one such state that he saw me while I was trying to do something to get into an out-of-body state. But it was not in an out-of-body experience, but by such a thought perception. So the advantage of the thought perception is you don't have to be there. You can hold this and perceive as is seen from far through a telescope. The fellow will not know that you're watching. Or as if looking into a mirror and you see the reflection of something far into your mirror, but your mirror is your consciousness. The person there will never know that you're seeing it. Or you get a thought impression, but then the impression may not be complete. Nevertheless, you know something is happening, but the person there will never know. But when you go out of the body and project yourself there, the person there, if they are sensitive, will know that you're there and can intervene. So I remember one of the out-of-body experience, not out-of-body, remote viewing perceptions described in a website which is called the Far Sight Project, where this person gives out tasks to various very well-known and reputed remote viewers, and then correlates from 2 different sources showing exactly the same thing. So, and they never know what it is they're being tasked to see. So one of them was given the task of going to Area 51. Those of you who know about this in UFO literature, it's a super secret military installation in the United States, underground, where everybody knows there are secret planes and high technology being developed, but what is not commonly known is that they also have recovered flying saucers, crashed UFOs, and replicas, and the technology is being tested and developed. So many things to do with extraterrestrial life are also being explored there. So this man who is tasked to go, Area 51, he doesn't know where it is he's being tasked to go. He finds underground many stories, many layers, and he goes all the way to some of the lowest. And in the lowest, when he enters, he finds this large room where there are as if containers with fetuses, like artificial wombs, but they are not human, they are of a grey species, non-human, extraterrestrial. And as he is going around, there is a grey who's there, who notices that he is present, and he is able to throw him out by a strongly developed mental power. So that shows in the grey being, extraterrestrial, there was a clairvoyant ability. Being in the physical body, he is able to sense that someone has come in the subtle body and is able to knock him out. And again that he tried, he was thrown out. Again, it's a capacity human beings also may have, but it shows that particular species involved there had already a very advanced, what we will call psychic powers, very developed. But in this case, it was the remote viewing was actually a kind of a projection. And there's another kind of remote viewing which is a reflection, where you can watch something and they will never know that it's being watched. Similar thing happened when the remote viewers in the United States under the military program in the 1980s were asked to spy on the Russians. And they projected themselves, went into the room where the Russians were doing their own thing, and there was a Russian psychic who registered that there was somebody who had come into the room. And then they went out of the body and traced back from where this person had come and got to their place and saw them. And the person who writes this in the book, I don't remember now, I think it was some Smith, he says they were so embarrassed because it didn't fit their understanding of reality that they did not dare tell their military heads what had happened. And much later, when the Cold War ended and these researchers met in some international conference, they actually exchanged notes of how they had seen each other, but they dared not say it to their own program heads because it was too far beyond their understanding of reality. So I'm just putting this in context, what Aurobindo has described using these three words: thought perception, thought reception, and thought impression, analogous to that phenomenon which we call telepathy. But it's not that, it's a much more direct. What we have as telepathy is very superficial and indirect. But the powers of the dream state of trance consciousness in which the But the powers of the dream state do not end here. It can, by a sort of projection of ourselves in a subtle form of the mental body, actually enter into other planes and worlds, or into distant places and scenes of this world, move among them with a sort of bodily presence, and bring back the direct experience of their scenes and truths and occurrences. Now, this is not yet out-of-body experience. This is a projection of consciousness into those worlds. And any plane, any world, any scene, by a sort of bodily presence, you feel as if you're there, but it's a projection of your consciousness. And you bring back the experience. This is the most common thing used normally. And then beyond this is one more phenomenon. He says it may even project actually the mental or vital body for the same purpose and travel in it, leaving the physical body in the profoundest trance without sign of life until its return. So now, depending on the degree of projection of the mental or vital body, the physical body may go into a trance, a deeper trance, or even a cataleptic trance, or it may just be in deep sleep, depending on the degree of projection and also the ranges that you enter into. So there are again a series of phenomena, broadly three grades, what he has described as this thing analogous to telepathy, those three types. And then there is a part where a consciousness partially projects and wanders by sort of bodily presence to bring back the direct experience of the scenes and truths and occurrences. And The third degree is where actual mental or vital body is projected. Now, it's such a broad summary form in which he states, but with the hints of nuance. Mental body as distinct from vital body. There are two kinds of outer body experiences, and they have different capacities or qualities and the nature of the experience. Now, all this you will say, wow, that's interesting, fascinating, okay, but where is the benefit for the yoga and for the integral yoga particularly? Yes, all this is useful, as we will shortly see, but the greatest value of the dream state of samadhi lies, however, not in these more outward things, but in its power to open up easily higher ranges and powers of thought, emotion, will, by which the soul grows in height, range, and self-mastery. So in that state, all these things can be more easily opened up. Especially withdrawing from the distraction of sensible things, it can, in a perfect power of concentrated self-seclusion, prepare itself by free reasoning, thought, discrimination, and more intimately, more finally, by an ever deeper vision and identification for access to the divine, the supreme self, the transcendent truth, both in its principles and powers and manifestations, and in its highest original being. I'm not going to elaborate on all these, but you can see these represent categories of increasingly more complete and deep spiritual ranges of experience, and each is a whole range of experience. So this, in a perfect power of concentrated self-seclusion, you withdraw completely into yourself, and by free reasoning, thought, discrimination, and more intimately, more finally, by an ever deeper vision and identification, you perceive and you identify with. And that's the natural state of knowing increasingly as you go deep. What do you perceive and identify with? To the divine, the supreme self, the transcendent truth, in its principles and powers and manifestation, and highest original being. All this becomes accessible. Of course, you don't access all equally at once or easily at once, because you are developing your capacity to withdraw, developing to deepen, developing to go higher, deeper, more complete, and so on. But once you're there, all this becomes far more easily accessible than if you're stuck in an embodied state where everything has been dulled and reduced. Or it can, by an absorbed inner joy and emotion, as in a sealed and secluded chamber of the soul, prepare itself for the delight of union with the divine beloved, the master of all bliss, rapture, and ananda. So it is like an absorbed inner joy and emotion in the chamber of the soul, and you have the immersion in the ananda with the divine presence, which is you, which is within you, your most inmost soul, your most inmost truth of being. Or this, again, two broad directions. Now comes the full import for the yoga. For the integral yoga, this method of samadhi may seem to have the disadvantage that when it ceases, you come out. The thread is broken and the soul returns into the distraction and imperfection of the outward life, with only such an elevating effect upon that outward life as the general memory of these experiences may produce. So I come back from that deep immersion and I say, oh my God, I've forgotten most of it. So only that much remains which I remember at it, or so it seems. But this gulf, this break is not inevitable, because on coming back you're losing a lot, isn't it? Like in return from the sleep dream state. And that's why the practice of dream state recall will be so important. For those of you who have done it, please continue. But this break is not inevitable, he says. In the first place, it is only in the untrained psychic being that the experiences of the trance are a blank to the waking mind. So the psychic being here is the psyche being of the inner, not the psychic being. This vocabulary, remember, Sri Aurobindo writes this before he began to use the word psychic being. So the psyche, inner being, antahkarana, we may broadly say, untrained inner being that these experiences are a blank to the waking mind. You come out, I've forgotten, because you didn't train. And that's why this training is so important. As it becomes the master of its samadhi, it is able to pass without any gulf of oblivion from the inner to the outer waking. How? Simply by making a slow transition and on return recalling, going back and forth, repeating until through layers you build the continuity all the way to the surface waking state. Go back again and again build continuity. Go back again and build continuity until there comes a point where you feel the continuity of consciousness. It's like a bridge formed. You don't lose it. But you do feel it reduced when you're here. You shift back in the inner and you have it fully again. You come back to the surface and you have a reduced version of it, but the continuity is there. And you can slide from this to that, from that to this without losing. Secondly, when this has been once done, what is attained in the inner state becomes easier to acquire by the waking consciousness and to turn into the normal experience, powers, mental status of the waking life. So let's say you have gone in that state you have opened to a certain dimension of experience. Let's say in this case, you have experienced deep closeness with your psychic being. You come out, in most cases already there's a massive reduction. But let's say now you have built that continuity, enough that on return you still feel a strong outpouring of that influence. Once done in the inner state of a deep immersion, you come out, you don't have the immersion, you feel almost like a passage from which something flows out. You stay here. But now in this state you can develop the familiarity and the recall and even gradually bring the experience of immersion more and more directly. Because you have the experience and because the link is built through which a strong influence of that experience can come in the outer layers and acclimatize the outer layers and rapidly get the outer layers to become familiar with that experience more directly. You enter into a state which may be of a vast consciousness. You return into the smallness of the body. In the immediate return, the impact of the vast is strong. You train the body now to relax and open to this vast. The result will be in a few days, and it will not take you more than that. In a few days, in the physical consciousness, you can consciously open to this memory of the vast. And the body can as if reflect or receive the impression of a true infinity, which belongs normally to the higher ranges, which is impossible for the body consciousness in itself. Had you never had that and you try to bring it from the body consciousness, you won't get far. You'll keep extending your sensory perception and that's it. But having experienced a widened, liberated infinity of imprint of consciousness, you have touched the sense of eternity and you bring it into the physical consciousness. The body says, yes, that's what it is like. Then you can teach the body to, or the surface mind, or the surface emotions. Having had it on a deeper layer, getting it on the surface now becomes easy. Once done there, attained in the inner state, becomes easier to acquire by the waking consciousness. The subtle mind, which is normally eclipsed by the insistence of the physical being, that is hidden and like an eclipse, the moon covers the sun, becomes powerful even in the waking state. The subtle mind becomes powerful in the waking state. Until even there, the enlarging man is able to live in his several subtle bodies as well as in his physical body. To be aware of them and in them. To use their senses, faculties and powers to dwell in possession of supraphysical truths, consciousnesses and experience. At the same time as being in the physical. Now you'll understand many things which otherwise don't make sense. When the mother would be asked certain kinds of questions, she would close her eyes and as if go into deep trance. Access something, do something there and then come out and open eyes again and engage. But at other times as she is speaking, she is already operating on other levels and doing things. And sometimes she says she is meeting other beings on other levels while talking to you here physically. Multi-layered awareness. But also at times there was a need for withdrawing from the surface to do something precisely which needed a particular action or a particular exclusivity of concentration for which the withdrawal from the surface was needed. But not always. Other than that, you could live on multiple levels and act on multiple levels at the same time. So reread this and you will fully appreciate the importance of the method of samadhi for the integral yoga. Still not over. There's a little more that stays. In fact, there are 2 paragraphs which we have run out of time, but I will just summarize and then perhaps next time. No, I'll just summarize then. So this was the description of the state which was called the dream state. The waking state is called traditionally Jagrat, and this state is called the Swapna. But of course it has nothing to do with dream, as we have seen. You are fully conscious. And in that so many phenomena are possible, but also the spiritual benefit of it. Then he describes what happens next in that which is called sleep state. The sleep state is that which is now supra-mental to us. It is the state of pure bliss, beyond emotion, beyond thought into pure consciousness. You go into the higher powers of the being. It's the link point between the Satchidananda and the activities of the world. So it's the supramental consciousness proper. And going into that domain, the nature of that experience, you have the poise of the true wisdom. You are the master of the wisdom, knowledge, the self of the gnosis, Lord of the being, Ishvara. But from there, if you were to come back to the physical mind, it would be a complete blank. So all that exceeds normal experience to the physical mind is seems like a dream, but at this point it goes even beyond that. So it can no longer see it as a dream. It passes into blank incomprehension and non-reception of slumber. So then he says, very important point here, he says is that the borderline where this happens varies according to the power of the individual consciousness with the degree and height of its enlightenment and awakening. And the key point which I will read now, the line, this boundary, the line may be pushed up higher and higher until it may pass even beyond the mind. Normally, indeed, the human mind cannot be awake even with the inner waking of trance on the supramental levels. But this disability can be overcome. And as you become aware on those higher levels, you have the mastery of the ranges of Gnostic thought, Gnostic will, Gnostic delight. All the things you read in the chapters of the synthesis of yoga in the later chapters are accessible in this state. And it can do this in samadhi and carry the experience over to the waking state. Along with the experience comes also the power of the experience into the waking state. And still beyond, it's the range of the Ananda, which is much more difficult. And you will say, he says, it's like as if you say, somehow indescribably I was in bliss, but that's all I can recall now. Even as you go further, the sense of being may disappear into something which is an extreme. Such is the principle of the yogic trance samadhi. Into its complex phenomena we need not now enter. That is when he is writing in the synthesis of yoga. It is sufficient to note its double utility in the integral yoga. It is true that up to a point difficult to define or delimit, almost all that samadhi can give can be acquired without recourse to samadhi. Now this is important for all of us. But still there are certain heights of spiritual and psychic experience of which the direct as opposed to a reflecting experience can only be acquired deeply and in its fullness by means of the yogic trance. And even for that, which can be otherwise acquired, it offers a ready means, a facility which becomes more helpful, if not indispensable, the higher and more difficult of access become the planes on which the heightened spiritual experience is sought. So the thing is this, without going into samadhi you can do a lot. But then there are ranges which you need absolutely some kind of samadhi, some kind of withdrawal, and it will happen naturally when you reach that stage. On the other hand, if you have access to the samadhi, even what you acquire which you can acquire without needing samadhi will be more easily acquired with samadhi if you have this capacity, if you have worked on it. So it's worth it to make the effort. But if you don't, it's fine also, one can go quite far. I'll give an example. There are many people I have met who will describe that they had experience of their psychic being. And while I would not doubt it, because when you listen to the experience, there's a particular vibration, you can say, yes, that was real. Yet, what they registered as an experience was a reflection in symbol. So they'll describe with perfect this quality, and even the vibe of that experience will be felt, but it was a reflection in symbol. As distinct from what you would do in using the samadhi, you would go deep within to a point where you would not be conscious of the world at all, you would be fully immersed, and that's when you can experience what it's like to be in formless quality of consciousness. And in that state, experience the psychic being directly as a presence, as a thing in itself. No more reflection, no more indirect representation, as a thing in itself, as a substance, as a being. And at that point, you actually realize, oh, this is literally a piece of Satchidananda, substance of Satchidananda, literally. And you understand why we are called child of the Satchidananda, etc. Why the psychic being can know the Satchidananda, because what it is can only be in itself, in its own terms, in its substantiality, known in that state of this deep immersion, which is not difficult. A little bit of effort, a little bit of sustained effort, one can get to that. But if you have not done this, then you will experience at some deeper layer as if a reflection of this, and sometimes a symbolic representation with full the force of an experience, but not knowing it in its own terms. Having got this, you may then experience it more directly on the surface, build from there a continuity, etc. more easily. So, all this is to say you do not need it, but having had it, it can be enormously useful if turned for the spiritual goals. Otherwise, you can get lost in exploration of the subtle worlds, vital worlds, mental worlds, and completely lose your way from your spiritual purpose, or get sucked into some high of an ego trip, or a deception of forces with which you have begun to engage in those wanderings, and all possibilities of distraction and dispersal, loss, and even serious repercussions and loss in on the spiritual way are possible if you do not have the clarity of your purpose. And it would then be as if you have lost yourself in the occult domain of wanderings. So we see here a very important principle. A conscious entry into the inner domains can be of great help if made a part of the sadhana and held as the primary goal as sadhana. And it can be used enormously to accelerate the process of the sadhana. Otherwise, it could also be a partial entry into some intermediate experience and then losing yourself into it, forgetting your larger goal. That also is equally possible. But generally what happens is, when you are in that state, what is to you more deeply rooted becomes the natural state of being, what is more true within you. And so, to be first firmly aligned in your aspiration, to be firmly centered and integrated around what we will call the psychic aspiration or the sense of purpose becomes essential. The more this is set, the more this is your base, the more your consciousness is aligned, centered around this aspiration, the more safe, easy, and helpful such an opening to inner ranges would become. Then we complete the text. Sri Aurobindo says, once attained there, it has to be brought as much as possible into the waking consciousness. For in a yoga which embraces all life completely and without reserve, the full use of samadhi comes only when its gains can be made the normal possession and experience for an integral waking of the embodied soul in the human being. That is, all that you have there in those states would be brought here and made normal in the surface consciousness with a full continuum of consciousness across all these planes and gradations and bodies. So I think with this we have answered all the significant questions that had come up. There are lots of comments and questions in the chat box, but since we have crossed the time, we'll take them up next time. Next time we'll continue with this topic with a few more texts of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo on the theme. where they go into specifics and sometimes in response to specific questions. This was a very broad chapter with the full picture that he has set for us. Then there are very specific examples and processes that have been described, and we'll take up these questions which have come up here in the chat box also. Let's take a moment now to review what we have been discussing, the importance of this in the sadhana, the potential that is possible with the consciousness that we already have, with the capacity we already have, what we need to do to be able to open to this potential, and central to it will be the concentration and centered on your primary soul aspiration. Begin your concentration with your aspiration aligned to the Divine Mother. Plunge deep in concentration, remain immersed, develop the capacity to go deeper and remain immersed, and build the link always from whatever experienced and held within to the surface. If you work on this and paralleling that with the recall of dreams in sleep state, you'll find it helps in the recovery from deeper experiences of the inner immersion. The rest will then unfold quite naturally and effortlessly. Always with your aspiration set to point to the Divine Mother and your sadhana and your purpose in the evolution, and beginning with remembrance of her but also calling for her protection. Because everything in life, as in yoga, can have its dangers. Sri Aurobindo says, except the discovery of the psychic being. But everything having its own limitations or dangers, always we call upon the Divine Mother's help and protection, that she may lead our journey, she may take us through these experiences to the extent that we are ready and she chooses.